New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring a newly identified altered state of consciousness known as meditation-induced near-death experience. My guest is Dr. William Van Gordon, who is a psychologist and lectures and conducts research in psychology at the University of Derby in England. He has also been a Buddhist monk for 10 years and received Buddhist ordinations from different schools, including the highest Buddhist monastic ordinations in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. He is on the editorial board of several journals, including Mindfulness and Mindfulness and Compassion. In addition, he has published over 100 academic papers and is the co-editor of 2 anthologies, one titled Mindfulness and Buddhist-derived Approaches to Mental Health and Addiction, and also the Buddhist Foundations of Mindfulness. Once again, this interview is being conducted on the internet. Dr. Van Gordon is in Italy. And now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, William. It's a pleasure to be with you. You've done some fascinating research. I think you're breaking new ground, and you also bring to the research some very interesting credentials since you yourself have been an ordained Buddhist monk for 10 years.
That's right, Jeff. It's nice to join you. And yes, my prior experience obviously informs the direction of my research.
Now, you have identified I'll call it an altered state of consciousness, which has never, to my knowledge, been discussed before in the literature, the meditation-induced near-death experience. So I think we should start by talking about the definition of that state of consciousness and something about the history of this tradition within Buddhism.
Okay. Yes, I think this was the first kind of study under formal research conditions to identify and investigate this phenomenon. And the background, if you like, stems from Buddhist philosophy and from Buddhist practice, where there exists a number of ancient texts that allude to this condition, that allude to the possibility of using meditation to gain insight into death. And some more contemporary Buddhist writers, such as the Dalai Lama, have also made reference to the use of meditation in this context.
Apparently, though, when you recruited meditators for your research, you were looking for people who had not only read allusions to the practice, but were actually rather well versed in it.
Exactly, and that was recruiting those participants was easier said than done, because actually there's no formal definition, no formal criteria for recruiting an advanced meditator, and we see advanced meditators taking part in research more and more these days. But it's actually a challenge to find those individuals where we can be sure, where we can have confidence that they are actually tapping into a genuine and altered state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, the recruitment window for this study remained open for 12 months. That was just to give us enough time to recruit individuals who met our inclusion criteria.
And the criteria, as I recall from reading your paper, included that they had to agree to engage in this particular practice of the meditation-induced near-death experience at least once a year, which suggests that they've already received instruction in the practice.
That's exactly right. So, really, we were looking to investigate, to observe what happened when participants underwent this practice, but we didn't want to force them to undergo this practice. They had to already be planning to undergo it naturally, mm-hmm. and as an ongoing in practice, because we wanted to see over the course of the 3 years how their perspective, how their experience changed while inducing a near-death experience using meditation.
So earlier you talked about the ancient texts alluding to this as a possibility, but it sounds as if in addition to the ancient texts, there must have been lineages where the practice was well understood, and there must be stages and preparation and follow-up and a rather extensive I guess I'd call it a pedagogy surrounding the practice.
I think that's right. It's important to stress this is a very advanced form of practice. And I think in some cases, individuals are taught the specific components of how to induce that state of meditation. Yet for other participants, I think just in reaching a very advanced stage of meditative development, I think they begin to understand how to elicit that experience themselves. I think it's something it's a direction that they go in naturally through the meditation when they reach a certain stage, I believe.
Perhaps without even the necessity of specific instruction.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Have you yourself engaged in this practice?
Yes, I've attempted to experience altered states of consciousness through meditation, including this one, as a means of improving my understanding of my own mind, of reality, and of meditative practice more generally.
So did you have an instructor who you worked with?
I had an instructor, but in my case, the focus was actually on a slightly different altered state of consciousness, which is generally referred to as emptiness, eliciting the experience of emptiness in meditation. Mm-hmm. And it was through that route that I was able to direct the meditation to start focusing on what type of processes might unfold when we reach the point when we have to leave this body.
Now, I understand that you recruited the participants from several different schools of Buddhism, so I presume that the instructions these meditators received were probably different.
That's precisely right. So this was very much a trans-Buddhist approach to studying this phenomenon. And you're exactly right. The routes those participants had taken in order to practice this technique were very different.
Did you make a point of understanding those differences?
Not particularly. Our focus was on whether the experience of the meditation-induced near-death experience was genuine, rather than the particular route they'd taken in order to develop or induce it. And I would envisage actually that there are individuals outside of Buddhist practice who can also engage in this practice, but that was kind of beyond the scope of the study this time.
Of course, there are a wide variety of shamans and mediums and spiritualists of different kinds who purport to have abilities in a wide variety of means for communicating with what we might call the Bardo planes. Now, and the classic near-death experience, as described by Raymond Moody and now many other researchers, seems to be a very distinct syndrome, now well identified in the medical and psychological literature, and it's often life-changing. People who have near-death experiences sometimes just say their life was changed dramatically and instantaneously. I would think it would be different for people who've been practicing meditation for 20 or 30 years.
I think so, but I think there are some overlaps. I think the participants in this study, they reported that one of their primary reasons for engaging in this practice was very much to change their perspective on life, to help them understand that all things are impermanent, that it's a good idea to make kind of full use of their time here, including preparing for what happens when their time here comes to an end. So it is life-changing, but it's more of a gradual, progressive process. And I think by the time they encounter this experience for the first time, they're probably much more prepared for it. It's an anticipated experience rather than a surprise experience, which is often the case in a traditional near-death experience.
I gather that the purpose of your study, it was a 3-year longitudinal study, is to document what the experience is like and also to document what impact it has on the meditators who practice it.
Exactly. And also another component was to document how it might change over time, really to see whether it's a learnable experience, whether it's an experience that can be practiced and perfected over time. And the findings indicated that it was indeed that kind of the profundity of the near-death experience and the profundity of the benefits associated with the experience increased over time.
Let's go into some detail then about the recruitment process. That's really where it began, I gather.
Sure. Well, as we mentioned before, this was a kind of trans-Buddhist approach to recruitment. So we were interested in really recruiting individuals that could genuinely elicit this experience. And one of the inclusion criteria was assessing their not only their general meditative experience, but whether they met kind of the cutoff point on the near-death experience scale. So whether they reported a certain degree of conformity to what we understand to be a regular near-death experience. And it wasn't only Buddhist monastics who we were interested in. There were lay practitioners. But as I indicated before, I think a key challenge in this study and any study working with advanced meditators is how to actually get around the challenge of being certain that study sample is genuine in terms of the experience under investigation. Because advanced meditator, there is no certificate, there's no academic qualification. Even if they're the head of some long-standing Buddhist lineage, that in itself is not proof of genuine meditative experience. And so I think whenever we look at findings working with advanced meditators, that's a potential limitation we need to be aware of.
You mentioned in your paper, for example, that the number of years a person spends practicing meditation is not necessarily a good indicator of how advanced they are in their practice.
I think that's right. I think it could be a person has 1 year of experience 20 times rather than 20 years of experience where they've continued to go deeper and deeper into the practice. And I think that specific point you've raised there is very relevant. Now there's a great deal of interest in meditation research, a great deal of interest in meditation and in teaching meditation, and caution therefore as to what constitutes being genuinely experienced is needed. But conversely, even after just 1 or 2 years of experience, I think it's possible for people to move quickly in their progress and definitely have something genuine to share.
Because you yourself have done an enormous amount of meditative practice, and your fellow researchers, I presume, as well. So you're connected to a network of Buddhist teachers and monasteries and so on that you utilized in recruiting.
Precisely. That's exactly the route we took. Rather than kind of just advertise to the general public openly, have you had this experience? We decided to be more purposeful in recruitment and recruit through networks and extended networks of practitioners, and kind of through word of mouth through the Buddhist practicing wider community.
You worked with meditation teachers that you've known for a long time and that you trust, and asked them to refer people that they regarded as advanced practitioners.
Precisely. That was one means of recruitment, and those individuals were in turn asked to pass on the message to other meditation teachers they felt were very good at assessing meditation experience, and it unfolded in that manner.
So using that network, I gather you got about 30 or 40 applicants, and eventually they were narrowed down to about a dozen.
That's right. So some of them didn't meet all of the inclusion criteria, which even in some cases was just a lack of proficiency in English language. So they may have had a very genuine experience to share, but we set the criteria to be as rigorous as possible in a preliminary study of this nature. Some individuals didn't want to be involved, and we have to respect that choice. So eventually we filtered down to 12 participants.
Mm-hmm. And because you mentioned you administered the, I believe, Dr. Bruce Grayson's scale for the intensity of the near-death experience, it's widely recognized as a standard measurement of near-death experience. So you're looking for people who have already completed the practice at least once.
Exactly, yes. And these are people who have already engaged in that practice. They're already familiar with it and can therefore provide some feedback on what they experienced during the last engagement in the meditation-induced near-death experience.
Is it the case that some of them may have practiced it many, many times and other people only once? I
think so. There was some diversity. I think in the number of times they practiced, but everyone had at least engaged in the practice previously.
Once you had your pool of applicants, then they were all subjected not only to the Grayson scale for intensity of near-death experience, but also a number of other psychological batteries. That's
right. We administered a number of other tests, one of which was to assess mystical experiences in general. Another was to assess non-attachment, which is an interesting psychometric test. It's assessing the degree to which the individual is attached to external phenomena, to their experiences, but therefore it's also assessing the extent to which they're attached to themselves. It's almost a measure of ego attachment, which in the traditional Buddhist literature is deemed to be a very important measure of well-being, and also of insight as well.
As I think about it, it's been about 20 or 30 years since I first interviewed a Buddhist meditator, and at that time it was about the application of Buddhist meditation and psychotherapy. And I'm not a practicing Buddhist myself, although I might look like one, but my sense is that what's happened in the last 30 years or so is that the integration of Buddhist philosophy and Western psychology has made enormous progress. You yourself have edited several anthologies in that area.
Yes, there's been a huge development in recent decades, a huge joining of scientific and traditional contemplative practice, and I think there's some really important insights that have come out of that, including in the kind of psychotherapy context, but not only that, in other contexts too, in terms of understanding a general reality, in terms of understanding the mind, and I think there's much more to come, Jeff. Actually, I think it's at the intersection of science, of traditional scientific approaches and contemplative practice, where we're hopefully going to see some more groundbreaking insights in terms of our understanding of the mind and of reality.
I presume, for example, the test you administered relating to non-attachment came out of this matrix of Buddhist psychology.
That's precisely right. Yes, that scale is kind of built on a Buddhist kind of meditation model and a Buddhist well-being model, and that scale is being used kind of more and more now, which is nice to see, including in clinical contexts. We're starting to see a strong association between being less attached to ourselves and well-being. So it's a very different model of self, of ego, that type of scale is introducing to the scientific and the psychological community compared to traditional psychological conceptions of self.
So you have about a dozen advanced meditators who have passed all of your criteria and have been administered these batteries of tests. Then what happened in your study?
Okay, so then the meditators were asked to contact us at the point when they were going to engage in the meditation-induced near-death experience. And that time point was to be chosen at their leisure. We asked them to continue with the practice that they would otherwise be making, rather than engage in a new practice specifically for the purposes of this research. There are some kind of ethical reasons for following that approach. And then just before the meditation-induced near-death experience. They filled in, they completed the psychometric tests we've just discussed. They completed them again just after. And they were also asked to engage in two other forms of meditation, which were used as a control condition. So that was a meditation in which they contemplated death, but didn't induce the near-death experience, and a meditation in which they just practiced standard kind of concentrative and mindfulness techniques, just so we had a comparison. And they were asked to contact us again before and after those. I think there was a 24-hour window in which they were requested to contact us, and that process continued for 3 years.
So if I'm a meditator and I'm about to induce one of these practices, either the control practice or the meditation-induced near-death experience practice, how long would those practices last? Would it be minutes, hours, days, weeks?
I think for this group of participants, it was between 40 minutes and 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours of kind of conventional time. That was the reported duration window. But interestingly, whilst engaged in the meditation-induced near-death experience, their perspective on time and how long they'd been engaged in the practice differed or changed considerably.
If I were to engage in that practice, let's suppose that I'm an advanced meditator and I wish to engage in that practice, how much time would I need to set aside? Okay,
well, obviously, even for advanced meditators, I think there are some differences in how quickly they can elicit that experience. It could depend on how much normal meditation they'd done in the foregoing days, how settled and focused the mind was. But I think it would be possible under the right conditions to enter into that state of meditation and complete that experience within an hour in some cases, in other cases within a few hours for the right participant.
Are there other preparations required, like dietary, for example, or physical postures or exercises?
That wasn't something we picked up as a key observation. There are preparatory meditation practices, however, that we did report on, and the route to inducing the near-death experience was twofold. The first kind of phase involved focusing and concentrating the mind, really to collect it, and to eliminate any distractions that there might be. And then followed a phase of what I refer to as investigative meditation, which really involves letting go of the self, transcending the self, and from that point, the meditation practitioner can move their meditation in several different directions, including towards completely or almost completely letting go of their connection with their body, and then they can start to engage properly in the near-death experience.
The near-death experience, especially as described in Raymond Moody's initial book on the subject, Life After Life, has a very distinct features like going through a tunnel, being accompanied by what might seem to be other spiritual entities that serve as guides, sometimes encountering deceased relatives or friends. And from a parapsychological point of view, it's especially interesting when those encounters include individuals that the experiencer didn't even know were deceased. Are those the sorts of things that your meditators also reported?
Yes. There was a good degree of crossover between the two kind of forms of near-death experience, the conventional and the one induced by meditation. And there were also some differences, but sure, out-of-body experiences and meeting kind of non-worldly entities, and an altered perception of time and space. These are components that are common to both forms of near-death experience. And also being the capacity to review one's life. There was an interesting difference there in that, in the case of the participants of this study, they had, rather than a lifetime review, which is a kind of a standard near-death experience, they had a lifetimes review, which was interesting. And there were also some differences as well. I think one key difference was for the Buddhist meditators in this study was actually understanding that the content of their near-death experience was in effect mind-generated. They were more interested in the nature of their near-death experience rather than the content of it. And they use those type of insights to understand more about the nature of their mind. Mm-hmm. A fascinating insight from my own perspective was that they saw that experience, the near-death experience, was mind-made. It was of the nature of emptiness. It was real, but yet it was empty of inherent existence, which is the same type of, which is the same nature that unfolds in the dream state. And those meditators in this study and in another study I've recently conducted went one step further, and they posited that we could use that same type of perspective of seeing those kind of altered states of consciousness as mind-made, the dream state and the near-death experience state, and even apply that to waking state consciousness. They asserted that things might not exist in the real world in precisely the manner that we think they exist. Things might not be quite as real as we've been led, or as we've led ourselves to believe. And that's an interesting insight from my perspective.
Did that surprise you?
It didn't surprise me, but it surprised me that that was an observable outcome from this specific form of meditation. I anticipated that the outcomes that we reported ultimately would be very content focused, in the sense that, okay, there was this phase followed by that phase, and participants to experience this and this and that. But very much the emphasis was on the nature, the wider nature of the experience. And I was pleased that outcome was observable through the recorded transcripts.
I presume that you weren't really looking for anything of a parapsychological nature in this particular study.
I think we were open-minded as to what outcomes might be experienced. So it wasn't a specific focus of the study. We did use a mysticism scale to try and tap into parapsychological experiences. But an interesting kind of dialogue that emerged from this study is that these participants were experiencing what we would deem to be mystical or parapsychological experiences, yet they didn't consider them as such. For those participants, mystical was normal. It was it's only mystical because it's perhaps not an experience that the wider population encounters on a frequent basis.
I mean, for example, did any of your meditators report communication with specific deceased individuals?
Yes. There was communication with both individuals that they didn't know, but also with individuals that they did know. So there was a communication with recently deceased beings, with beings from other realms, friendly realms and not so friendly realms reported. But some participants reported communication with their former teacher who had since departed, or I think in some cases may not have departed. And that was a specific a dialogue with a known individual.
A known living individual.
I think so in some cases, yes. And also a known deceased individual.
I see. So when the meditators report to you that these are not so different from dream experiences, it does raise a question of ontology. I mean, did they think that those communications with deceased individuals were a product of their own mind only?
Okay, so I think what they were alluding to is that rather than the near-death experience being like a dream, they were alluding to a view, a Buddhist perspective, that in fact what we deem to be waking reality, it is almost like a shared dream. It doesn't exist in the inherent sense of the word. If we tried to find something that we could call the present moment, we would never find it. And there's some scientific kind of foundations to that too. So obviously there could be a form of ontological conditioning through which they interpret their experience. But I believe that certainly from the Buddhist perspective, the belief in a non-inherently existing reality, it is deemed to be an ultimate belief. It's deemed to stem from genuine meditative insight. And therefore it's deemed to kind of transcend beliefs, if that makes sense.
It does, but of course from a research perspective, it also raises the question you referred to, a conditioned ontological conditioning. And another way to think of it might be that what they're engaged in is a process not so different from hypnosis. And since these people have been steeped in Buddhist philosophy, they have in effect been hypnotized to report experiences that would be consistent with all of the suggestions that they've received to that effect over many years.
Of course. And any study of this nature, as a scientist, as a researcher, one has to understand that the kind of the generalizability of this These findings may not extend beyond this specific group of Buddhist meditators because of their conditioning. But then again, if the beliefs that they'd been fed as part of their training stemmed from an accurate portrayal of reality, then it could be that they're tapping into accurate beliefs that, to a certain degree, transcend that conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one could look at that outcome either way. I think one important outcome from this study is that there were some differences from the conventional NDE, but I think those are arguably explained by the fact in this study participants retained volitional control over their near-death experience. So they were able to almost direct it to a certain degree. And I think inevitably, if one's able to delve deeper into the near-death experience, and to do so volitionally, then it's likely there will be some new insights to report.
This practice continued for 3 years, with the meditators engaging in the practice at least once a year. I assume some of them perhaps did it several times a year.
Absolutely, yes. There was a difference in the kind of frequency, the annual frequency with which they engaged in this practice. But we asked them to report outcomes linked to the first time within that 12-month period that they engaged in the practice, and to do that for each year. Yeah.
After 3 years of collecting data, what conclusions were you able to draw?
So we observed a statistically significant kind of improvement, if you like, in the profundity of the near-death experience, in terms of how it increased over time, as well as in the kind of profundity of the associated experiences. Yet, interestingly, the profundity of the near-death experience was not associated with the duration of the meditation. So one might think that the longer a participant is engaged in this practice, kind of the deeper they're going to go into the near-death experience itself. If they were engaged for 3 hours rather than 1 hour, one might envisage they'd have more to report. And yet that wasn't the case. There was no significant relationship observed in that case, which is perhaps consistent with the understanding both in the traditional and the conventional near-death experience and in the meditation-induced near-death experience, that actually this practice, this process involves transcending conventional understandings of time and space. There is no time when engaged in this practice.
In the literature of these kinds of experiences, if in a shamanistic tradition, for example, the shaman might be engaged in various forms of healing work or rescue work, saving lost souls, or helping other people through their transition in what we could call the Bardo Plains. Your meditators seem to report, I believe what you said is that they were really more interested in studying the nature of their mind itself. Did they report any other shamanistic-like activities?
Yes, they did. They did report those type of experiences and those type of contacts, in order to derive specific insights, specific spiritual insights for themselves or spiritual insights to share with others. And yet, and so content was an important aspect for them, secondary only to understanding the nature of that content.
This is really getting interesting, I have to say. And you mentioned earlier that instead of having a life review, they had a review of many lives. In other words, past lives, previous incarnations.
Exactly, yes. So that was a slight difference between the two forms of near-death experience. Yes, it was a lifetime's review. And I believe some participants also reported being able to see things in the other direction, to look forward in time as well, which added kind of further support to their report that in this state of consciousness that there isn't any time and there isn't any space. In as we understand it.
If one were to pursue your research paradigm further, it could involve, detailed exploration of what the Buddhists call the Bardo planes, and we might learn. It might be like the equivalent of discovering whole new continents.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of directions we can take this research in order to explore, investigate those Buddhist concepts further.
Do you have plans for further research?
Yes. This was the first kind of formal investigation of this phenomena under research conditions, and we based on the value of those insights, it's important, I feel, to pursue that further. And actually, one other study has been conducted, and that paper's been written up. So we're hoping that will find its way through to publication soon, and more studies are planned. I think we need to really now focus on precisely how and if and why this type of near-death experience differs from the conventional near-death experience. We need to address some of the limitations of this study and kind of devise more focused, more accurate measures for evaluating what happens in the meditation-induced near-death experience.
How much meditation experience is required before somebody could begin to enter into this practice?
Okay. I think it's not so much about years spent in training. It's about quality of meditation experience. And it's also about, I suppose, that individuals' propensity for spiritual insight. I think some individuals, for whatever reason, are just more inclined to progress quickly in meditation compared to others. But I think with the right focus, and I think there really has to be almost a complete dedication towards meditative and contemplative practice. I think with that in place, I think there's a very, very, very small minority of advanced meditators who could potentially elicit this experience after a few years. I think in most cases, though, it's going to be beyond a decade of very focused contemplative practice in reality.
Do you think it's possible for non-Buddhist meditators, let's just say Hindu yoga meditators, to participate in the kind of study that you're doing?
Yes, I do, and in fact, that's a direction I've been discussing with some colleagues in opening this up and in taking it onto a trans-religious plane, and and therefore being able to recruit a greater number of participants and being able to explore further this ontological conditioning question.
Yeah.
But I certainly think there are other individuals outside of Buddhism who are who can elicit this experience and the specific components of it. And I think if you've trained in contemplative practice, regardless of your background, then I think by the time by the time you reach a point where you can foster this experience, I think you're likely to have a very different set of experiences to report, or at least to relate to the experience differently than an individual that's kind of been thrown into it due to some unfortunate traumatic event. And I think that's another important point to bear in mind.
Did you conduct in-depth interviews with your participants at the end of the 3-year period?
The interview actually was principally conducted in year 1. So this was a qualitative and a quantitative study. The quantitative assessments continued for 3 years. The in-depth qualitative interview was primarily conducted in year 1.
After they've had at least one experience?
Immediately after they'd had the experience.
And did you derive any specific conclusions then from those in-depth interviews?
Yes, there was a series of themes that seemed to be consistent across all participants' accounts, which alluded to almost a phasic process in which the near-death experience unfolded. It initiated with a process of what participants referred to as letting go of their connection to the elements, to the elements of, in their words, of earth, of water, of wind that comprise the body. And then I think the next phase they reported was an altered perception of time and space, moving beyond time and space into this experience of emptiness of self. Yet interestingly, through understanding they were empty of an inherently existing self, they also understood by default that they were full of all things, that they were connected deeply to all things, that they didn't exist in isolation and in separation from everything else around them, but were deeply connected to all things around them. So it was an emptiness of self and a fullness of everything was the next phase that they experienced, and after that followed encounters with non-worldly beings, lifetimes review, and the other kind of components we've been discussing today.
Now, normally in the near-death experience, there's a point at which the individual has a choice to remain in the transcendental state or to return to physical life back in their body. I assume that was never an issue for your meditators.
That was reported as an outcome, but in a very different context to the conventional NDE. The meditators reported just leaving the most tiniest kind of thread of contact between their near-death experience mind state or their near-death experience body and their physical worldly body, and they used that thread in order to return to their worldly body when they felt they'd reached the end of that particular practice. So I don't think in this case not returning was ever an option. It was a case of how long they were going to stay in that specific meditative state and until they'd derive whatever kind of spiritual insights they felt were important at that stage.
Now, you use the word thread, and I'm not clear whether you meant it as a metaphor or as perhaps something tangible, because I know in the out-of-body literature, there's sometimes reference made to what they call the silver cord, connecting what some people describe as the astral body to the physical body. Did you mean something like that?
Participants didn't report in this study a physical or a thread made of light. They used the word a connection. I've interpreted that as a thread. I think it was more just some form of loose connection to remind them that actually this was a practice and not the real thing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they did report that whilst they weren't aware of what was happening around their physical worldly body during the near-death experience, in the event it was kind of subjected to a sudden change of temperature or it was suddenly feeling discomfort, that would draw them back. Mm-hmm. So yeah, a loose connection in that sense.
Also in the near-death experience, it's sometimes reported if a patient is in a hospital, perhaps in surgery, they often see themselves like positioned at the ceiling of the operating room, looking down and seeing their body and seeing the doctors around them. Did your meditators report anything of that sort?
Something similar. They reported being aware of two bodies. They reported being aware of their near-death experience body and of being aware of their physical worldly body, but not in the sense of kind of hovering over it and observing what was happening. It was just an awareness that body was there, and I understand that they were able to kind of shift their awareness to focus more on the near-death experience body, and also, if need be, to shift that awareness back to focus on their worldly body. But they had kind of volitional control over that, and their focus was as I understand it, on their near-death experience body, mostly.
Now, I would assume that some of the ancient texts, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, was written on the basis of reports from advanced meditators, or perhaps the author himself had these direct experiences and reported on them. I presume that's the way Buddhist tradition holds these texts.
That's precisely right. In traditional Buddhist contexts, the experiences reported by a meditation master were received with great value by Buddhist participants, and we've almost seen a reversal in terms of the value placed on specific forms of evidence. If you consider the evidence pyramid that we often come across in traditional scientific research settings now, the opinion of an expert comes at the bottom of the pyramid, whereas evidence in the form of data from randomized controlled trials would be deemed to be the most reliable form of evidence. But in the traditional Buddhist setting and in other traditional contemplative settings, the insights of a meditation of a spiritual master were awarded the greatest amount of value. And you're precisely right. That kind of body of textual insights stems from experiences shared by such meditation master.
In a way, what you're doing reminds me of William James' notion of radical empiricism, that these kinds of experiences are not normally thought of as empirical evidence, but you're taking them as such. And it seems to me that there is good philosophical justification for that from American pragmatic philosophy as well as Buddhist philosophy.
Yes, I think there are robust empirical methods we can apply to investigate and explore these types of altered states of consciousness, and I think those kind of methods are always developing. I think they're becoming more accepted. I think there's a number of new qualitative methods that have emerged that we can apply in addition to quantitative approaches. I think it would be nice actually to explore what's happening neurologically while individuals are engaged in this practice. And I think that's one of the potential benefits or potential kind of potential interesting ways in which we can develop this research, because with a conventional near-death experience, it's that there's a lot of ethical issues and logistical challenges associated with monitoring neurological activity while this experience is unfolding. But with the meditation-induced near-death experience, because participants can elicit that experience voluntarily, then there is scope for investigating using other techniques, which is an interesting future direction.
I assume that you haven't yet moved in that direction.
We're moving in that direction currently. That is a study I'm currently planning out and recruiting the right research team in order to take the research forward. Yeah.
Well, William Van Gordon, this has been very exciting. I think you're doing groundbreaking research, and I can well imagine that 20 years from now, we'd be able to look back and see that there's been considerable progress along the lines that you have pioneered. Thank you so much for being with me.
It's been lovely to talk to you, Jeff. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.